A glorious restoration, Ezekiel. And just to remind us where we've been, we've concluded our series looking at what it might mean to be the church of tomorrow. But I wonder, as we've gone through that series and considered that theme and had different themes Sunday by Sunday exploring that, I wonder whether there's been a sense that actually, as we've looked around at ourselves and thought about our own lives individually, there's been a thought that actually, you know what, forget looking towards tomorrow, actually being the church today in the current climate and culture can be hard enough and be enough aware of challenges. Yet, no, we're not facing outright persecution. Unlike some of our brothers and sisters around the world who don't have that openness to worship, don't have that openness to share their faith. But nevertheless, there might be a sense that today's culture, with all that's going on, all the different things that are being explored, there might be a feeling that, hang on, we feel like we're being pushed to one side, pushed to the margins, not being listened to so much, not being at the centre of things. Actually, is that such a bad thing? I don't know. And yet, there are signs of hope. Stuart shared for his missional input on the fourth Sunday lunch in April some of the results from a recent survey from the Bible Society about something they've coined a phrase for, a quiet revival. And if that's not something you've heard of or read about, I would recommend following up for yourself and maybe taking time to discuss it in your small groups, some of those details. But in a brief summary, it talked about a silent revival, quiet revival, especially amongst the younger people, wanting to explore church and spirituality, perhaps for the first time. And as I was pondering that, a phrase came to mind, one that Elijah refers to, when he asks one of his servants to keep going out looking for what's happening. When he talks, eventually the servant comes back, I think it's on something like the seventh time, and Elijah refers to a cloud as small as a man's hand rising from the sea. Could it be that maybe something like that is happening in our society at the moment? This sense of a cloud as small as a man's hand rising from the sea. We haven't got full-blown revival and all the rest of it like some of the classical ones that you might read about in church history. But nevertheless, maybe something is starting to stir. So with all that in mind, here we are beginning an exploration of an Old Testament book that I suspect is not all that well known amongst a lot of Christians. I could be doing them a disservice. But if a straw poll of the Old Testament prophetic books was to be done, if you were to go to any typical church and say, name me an Old Testament prophetic book, rather like, when they go on Pointless and they give you 100 seconds to name all the things, then I suspect Isaiah would be probably at the top, Jeremiah, Daniel maybe for his, amongst the lion's den, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. Ezekiel, I suspect Ezekiel maybe get down towards the lower end of that 100-point scale. Maybe not Pointless. That will probably be for your Zeds, your Zechariahs and your Zephaniahs and all the rest of it. But Ezekiel will probably be pretty low. But that's what we're exploring at the moment. And if we could have slide 1, and I haven't got my zapper up here. So Colin, could you do the honours from the back? Hey, brilliant, it's behind you. Hang on, that's the wrong time of year. Anyway, yet there are some quite significant themes in this book. Yes, of judgment, but also of hope amid the restoration. And with that in mind, let's watch a Bible Project video clip that helps to briefly outline the structure of the book, doing it a lot better than I probably could. Thanks, Colin.
The book of the prophet Ezekiel. Ezekiel was a priest who had been living in Jerusalem during the first Babylonian attack on the city. And they spared the city, but they took a first wave of Israelite prisoners and hauled them off into exile, and Ezekiel was among them. So the book begins 5 years after all that, and Ezekiel is sitting on the bank of an irrigation canal near his Israelite refugee camp, and it's his 30th birthday, no less, the year that he would have been installed as a priest in Jerusalem. And then all of a sudden, Ezekiel has this vision. He sees a storm cloud approaching, and then inside the cloud are 4 strange creatures that have wings outstretched and touching each other. And these creatures each had 4 faces. And then he saw 4 wheels, one by each creature. And then he saw that the wings of the creatures were supporting this dazzling platform, and then on that platform is a throne. And then sitting on that throne is this human-like creature, glowing and shrouded in fire. And then all of a sudden Ezekiel realizes what he's seeing. He calls it the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. It's God riding his royal throne chariot. Now the word glory, in Hebrew it's kavod, it means heavy or significant. The biblical authors use this word to describe the physical appearance and manifestation of God's significance when he shows up in person. These images in the vision, they're very similar to what happened when God appeared on Mount Sinai in the book of Exodus. And it's also very similar to the depictions of God's presence over the Ark of the Covenant. And that's actually the most shocking thing about Ezekiel's vision. What is God's glory doing in Babylon? It's supposed to be above the Ark of the Covenant, in the temple in Jerusalem. And so the first section of the book opens to explore that question as Ezekiel begins to accuse Israel of rebellion. So God first speaks to Ezekiel from the throne chariot, and he commissions him as a prophet. Ezekiel is to accuse Israel of breaking their covenant agreement with God in a couple ways. Israel has given their allegiance to other gods and has been worshiping idols, and this has all led to rampant social injustice and violence. And so as a result, God appoints Ezekiel to warn the people. The first Babylonian attack that took Ezekiel into exile is going to be matched by another, and Jerusalem, its temple, all face imminent destruction. So Ezekiel uses words and more to get his message across. He also performs sign acts. These were a form of street theater. Ezekiel would go out in public and start behaving in these really bizarre ways that were like parables of his prophetic message. So he was supposed to build a tiny model of Jerusalem and then stage an attack on it. Or he was to shave off all of his hair and then chop it up with a sword. Or the most extreme, he was to play the role of the scapegoat on the Day of Atonement. And he would lay on his side for over a year, eating food cooked over poop, as a sign of the nasty food that people will have to eat during the siege of Jerusalem. And perhaps the most disheartening thing of all is the bad news God gave Ezekiel that no one was going to listen to him. Israel would reject him because of their rebellious and hard heart. And this recalls Moses' description of the people after the wilderness rebellions, when he predicted that exile would one day happen, and Ezekiel had the unfortunate privilege of seeing it all come to pass. And so a dismayed Ezekiel, he begins to perform his task. And after about a year, he has another vision. This one is about the temple. He goes on this virtual tour of the temple, and he sees what's happening there in his absence, and it is not good. In the outer courtyard in front of the temple, he sees this large idol statue. And then he sees the elders of Israel worshiping other gods, both outside and inside the temple. And then he sees the women of Israel. They're worshiping a Babylonian god named Tammuz. And the vision ends with God's glorious throne chariot moving up and away from the temple. It's leaving, going east, headed towards Babylon. And so in chapter 11, we come to see why and how God's glory appeared to Ezekiel there in Babylon. Israel's idolatry and their covenant violations, it's become so blatant and offensive that God has left his temple. They've driven him away, and he consigns it to destruction. But God hasn't abandoned his people. Rather, he goes into exile with them. And so at the end of this vision in chapter 11, God promises that he will return a remnant of Israel back to the land, and he'll transform them by removing their heart of stone and giving them a new, soft heart of flesh, so that they can love and truly follow their God after all. This is a small glimmer of hope, and it's quickly submerged under the reality of the imminent destruction. But chapter 11, it's a key transition, and it helps us understand how the rest of the book has been designed. So the next 3 sections are all announcements of God's judgment, first on Israel, then on the nations around Israel, and then on Jerusalem itself. But then after that, the hopeful conclusion of chapter 11 gets developed in the final 3 sections of the book. First, hope for Israel, then for the nations, and then for all creation. Chapters 12 through 24 focus on God's judgment coming to Israel. And this is a diverse collection of poems and essays. And here Ezekiel shows his fondness for parable and allegory. So he depicts Israel as a burnt, useless stick, or as a rebellious wife, or as a dangerous, raging lion that gets captured, or as 2 promiscuous sisters. These are all depictions of Israel's senseless rebellion and idolatry that results in their ruin. In this section, Ezekiel also acts like a lawyer. He begins arguing the case that, first of all, Jerusalem's destruction is truly deserved after centuries of covenant violation, and that even if the most righteous people in the world, like Noah or Daniel or Job, were alive and praying for God to spare Israel, God would not accept their prayers. It's far too late. And so God's goodness actually demands that he bring justice on this generation of Israel. The exile has become inevitable. They've reached the point of no return. Following this, Ezekiel focuses first on the nations immediately around Israel, and then on the 2 most powerful states in the region, Egypt and then Tyre. Israel has allied with these nations and adopted their gods and their idols, and so God accuses the kings of Tyre and Egypt for arrogantly viewing themselves as gods who get to define right and wrong on their own terms. And God holds these kings accountable for their pride, and he announces that he will use Babylon to bring them down. They will face God's justice along with everybody else. Following these really intense sections is a short story in chapter 33. Ezekiel's met by a refugee who's just arrived from Jerusalem, and he gives him the report that Babylon has attacked the city of Jerusalem, that the city has fallen, and the temple is destroyed. Ezekiel's grim warnings have become a reality. But remember,
brief outline of things there. And as I say, we've got different themes that we're going to be exploring over the coming weeks. And if we can have that next slide up, then we can get a brief idea of where we're going. Colin, if you ready? Hang on. Just that technical bit of moving from video to PowerPoint slide. Brilliant. It's there. Okay. So we're looking this morning briefly at the glory God displays. Then next week we've got the idolatry God detests, looking at Ezekiel chapter 8. The covenant God keeps, the nation God judges, the people God restores, and the presence God establishes. When I say roadmap, as we begin our journey from Ezekiel, as you can see, it's not going to be an exhausted, detailed one looking at every verse. A better comparison would be to the journey that's undertaken in one of my favourite TV programmes, Race Across the World, where the competitors have a beginning point, they have a final point where they get their prize money, and there's checkpoints throughout the journey, checkpoints that they have to reach. And that's the kind of journey we're going to be looking at here on Sundays. However, for those of you that want to be adventurous and to explore the whole book, perhaps because you're thinking, I want to remind myself, I haven't looked at it for a long time, or perhaps because you're saying, actually, I've never explored this whole book before, then there were suggestions in the church email that went out of a suggested sort of reading plan to help you as we look through. So, Ezekiel chapter 1 is where we're looking at this morning. Ezekiel chapter 1, verses 1 to 28. In the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day, while I was among the exiles by the Kebar River, the heavens were opened and I saw visions of God. On the 5th of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel, the priest, the son of Buzi, by the Kebar River in the land of the Babylonians. There the hand of the Lord was upon him. I looked, And I saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning and surrounded by brilliant light. The centre of the fire looked like glowing metal, and in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. In appearance, their form was that of a man, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. Their legs were straight, their feet were like those of a calf and gleamed like burnished bronze. Under their wings, on their 4 sides, they had the hands of a man. All 4 of them had faces and wings, and their wings touched one another. Each one went straight ahead. They did not turn as they moved. Their faces looked like this. Each of the 4 had the face of a man, and on the right side each had the face of a lion, and on the left the face of an ox. Each also had the face of an eagle. Such were their faces. Their wings were spread out upwards. Each had 2 wings, one touching the wings of another creature on each side, and 2 wings covering its body. Each one went straight ahead. Wherever the Spirit would go, they would go, without turning as they went. The appearance of the living creatures was like burning coals of fire or like torches. Fire moved back and forth among the creatures. It was bright, and lightning flashed out of it. The creatures sped back and forth like flashes of lightning. As I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the ground beside each creature with its 4 faces. This was the appearance and structure of the wheels. They sparkled like chrysolite, and all 4 looked alike. Each appeared to be made like a wheel intersecting a wheel. As they moved, they would go in any one of the 4 directions the creatures faced. The wheels did not turn about as the creatures went. Their rims were high and awesome, and all 4 rims were full of eyes all around. When the living creatures moved, the wheels beside them moved, and when the living creatures rose from the ground, the wheels also rose. Wherever the Spirit would go, they would go, and the wheels would rise along with them, because the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. When the creatures moved, they also moved. When the creatures stood still, they also stood still. And when the creatures rose from the ground, the wheels rose along with them, because the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. Spread out above the heads of the living creatures was what looked like an expanse, sparkling like ice and awesome. Under the expanse, their wings were stretched out one towards the other, and each had 2 wings covering its body. When the creatures moved, I heard the sound of their wings like the roar of rushing waters, like the voice of the Almighty, like the tumult of an army. When they stood still, they lowered their wings. Then there came a voice from above the expanse over their heads as they stood with lowered wings. Above the expanse over their heads was what looked like a throne of sapphire, and high above on the throne was a figure like that of a man. I saw that from what appeared to be his waist up, he looked like glowing metal, as if full of fire, and from there down he looked like fire, and brilliant light surrounded him. Like the appearance of a rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day, so was the radiance around him. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. When I saw it, I fell face down, and I heard the voice of one speaking. Of course he did. Of course he fell down. Thinking about our society at the moment, one way of describing how we might be is that feeling of being in exile. Not physically like Ezekiel was, but in exile in the sense that this place, and indeed when we are living, is not our ultimate home. We feel out of our comfort zone. We don't seem to quite fit in terms of our values or perhaps our way of looking at things. And a rhetorical question, but one I wonder, how does that make us feel? Do you, do I, do we like certainty, everything to be settled? I wonder. Ezekiel felt that sense of exile, literally. He had also reached the point, as mentioned in the Bible Project video, and mentioned in the text there as well, where if he had been back home in Jerusalem, he would have been installed as a priest. So is there a sense in which he was sitting there with his hopes and his dreams in ruins? Perhaps maybe asking the question, where is God? Here is Ezekiel in this unclean land with no apparent purpose, because that's been taken away from him. If he'd been back in Jerusalem, yes, priest, terrific. Here he is in Babylon, in exile. What's going on? Where's God? And yet, God has not finished with him. God has a new calling for him, not as a priest offering sacrifices in a ceremonial role, but as a prophet, hearing from God and bringing it to the people. And yes, not going to be heard, but he's still an intermediary, but with a dramatically different purpose. And this calling that Ezekiel receives is rather dramatic, to say the least, as I've just read out. When you and I perhaps received our calling to become a Christian, I suspect not many of us had a calling like Ezekiel's, with wings and all the rest of it. Probably not even with a mobile phone call. But we might have had friends leading us, or all sorts of things. But I doubt if many of us had a dramatic calling like Ezekiel's had. But amidst it all, right at the very beginning, that he describes, there the hand of the Lord was on him. And Stuart helpfully reminded us recently about this definition of the glory of God. If we can have that slide up to remind us of that definition. The most important concept is that of the glory of God, the glory of Yahweh. This denotes the revelation of God's being, nature and presence to mankind, sometimes with physical phenomena. Sometimes with physical phenomena. I think all of Ezekiel chapter 1, you'd agree with me, certainly fulfills that criteria of physical phenomena. Storms, visions, sights of wheels within wheels and angels and all sorts of things going on. Of course, the glory of God isn't always with the physical phenomena. There's no hard and fast rules. Let's not try and put God in a box that he's always got to come with physical phenomena and make us feel in awe and all the rest. But nevertheless, there are verses from the Old Testament that remind us that yes, he can and does. So if we just have those up. The cloud covering the tent of meeting, the glory of the Lord filling the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because there the glory of the Lord was. Or alternatively, the next one. Have we got another one there? Moses and Aaron. Fire coming out from the presence of the Lord. And remember when Stuart took us through a preaching series looking at Exodus, there was this strong sense of God's presence, God's holiness. And that was at a time when God was travelling with his people, the clouds and fire. And yet, but this time, they're in Babylon. Babylon of all places. And God can't possibly be here, can he? Not in Babylon, in this unclean place. But here's where I wonder. I want to test your knowledge of old pop songs for a minute. Where is Steve going, I hear you ask? What tangent is he taking us off on? Well, think of a rather old pop song that went high up in the charts, that was based on one of the Psalms, that maybe captures something of what God's people might have been feeling at this point. Any ideas? And there was me in my preparation when I put this there. I thought, that could take at least 5-10 minutes going around asking them. But no, the congregation at Stony Stratford Community Church, you've come up with it. Bingo, straight away. Psalm 137. Yes, by the rivers of Babylon. Yes, that's the one. where we sat down. That's it. Let's just remind ourselves. It was in. I'm glad yes. By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. It was. There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? I wonder if that, as I say, that captured something of the sense of God's people. Here they are in exile, and this sense of sitting and weeping. How can we sing songs of the Lord when we're in exile? Can we do that? Can God really show up in Babylon in this sense when actually it's Jerusalem? But yes, he can, as Ezekiel chapter 1 shows us quite dramatically. And if we had the time, we could explore together all the symbolism going on in this passage, with heavens being opened, living creatures and thrones. But suffice to say that God is announcing to Ezekiel in no uncertain terms that here, yes here, even in Babylon, even though judgment has been passed and God's people have been sent into exile, nevertheless, God Almighty can be here, even here in Babylon. Just imagine for a moment the overwhelming of the senses, and I defy anyone, even the most calm, measured of individuals in this room, not to feel something of awe, of wonder, of maybe reacting like Ezekiel did, where at the end it talks about, when I saw it, I fell face down. To be faced with all of this, fire like glowing metal, an immense cloud, creatures with wings and wheels and rising up and moving around and all that sort of thing. No wonder that's his response, to fall face down. Think of some of the other callings in the Old Testament. Remember earlier I mentioned that perhaps Isaiah would be a book that people would think of when they thought of Old Testament prophets. Isaiah chapter 6, there he is in the temple, fulfilling his responsibilities. And what happens? Coals come from the altar. And his response, I'm a man of unclean lips. I live among a people of unclean lips. Or Jeremiah chapter 1, Jeremiah's response being simply that, well, I'm too young. Ah, sovereign Lord, I do not know how to speak. I'm only a child. That's what can so often happen when we meet and encounter the holiness of God, a sense of inadequacy. And you might say, oh, but Steve, that's Old Testament. New Testament now, we're living in grace. But consider for a moment Peter in the boat when Jesus approaches him after the miraculous catch of fish. And he says, get away from me, God, for I'm sinful. Or Nathanael's response to Jesus, knowing him in John's Gospel, Rabbi, you are the Son of God, the King of Israel. Ananias and Sapphira in Acts chapter 5, when they've broken their promise to give all the money. Or John in Revelation. You see, we play fast and loose with the nature of God at our peril. There was a heresy in the 2nd century church, Marcionism, if I've got my pronunciation right, that basically meant there was a theory that, oh yes, there's two different gods. There's an Old Testament God and there's a New Testament God, and they're totally different and they're not the same. But God doesn't change his nature between old and new. It seems to me that it's us playing catch up as we progressively understand more and more of God's character and his plans and purposes in the light of that revelation. At the Open Church meeting, Stuart reminded us of our Baptist heritage in terms of the declaration of principle. Another helpful topic for small groups to think about. Well, another little pointer from our first Baptist covenant gathering of Christians in 1612. There was this comment about we covenant to walk together, watch over one another, walking together in all God's ways, known and yet to be made known. Some humility there. The same kind of humility that Ezekiel shows when he's faced with God. And I have to say, when I was preparing for today and looking at this passage in Ezekiel with all its wheels and storms and wings and all the rest, I was struggling as to which direction to be taking. Do I go for the symbolism approach? Do I go for unpacking all this different symbolism as to what the wheels and the different faces mean and all that sort of thing? Or do I go historical with the exile and try to remind folk of all that was going on that way? The Bible Project video helped us with that a bit, maybe. And then I was reminded of a word that the prayer team felt they were being given at the beginning of the year. About losing our first love. And could there be an echo of that here, I wonder? Let me explain my reasoning. Returning to our beginning and that feeling of exile, uncertainty. Could it be that we need something like Ezekiel experienced in terms of a reminder of the holiness, the majesty, the awesomeness of God? You see, it's all very well when we're led well in worship like Elizabeth did this morning. And I don't know about you, but I sense that real God's presence as voices were being lifted and raised and we were being led in some of those songs with the wonderful words. But Ezekiel in his exile was sitting at the riverbank, looking around him, asking the question, where is God? Caught up in that Psalm 137 feeling, combined maybe with that sense of nostalgia of what might, should have, could have been. And as I look around this morning, there are a few silver hairs, or lack of hair in some cases. And of course, isn't that the prerogative of us older folk who've, getting on in years for a bit of nostalgia? Does that ring any bells? Well, maybe we need to stay listening as we follow through Ezekiel. Stay listening and actually hear some of the themes that come out. And maybe that sense of first love will be rekindled as we once again come across God's holiness and are reminded of his glory, reminded of his power, his majesty. Now, I'm not suggesting that we're all going to experience the wings and the storm and all the rest. Although we might do, I don't know. But as we continue our journey through Ezekiel, let us pray for that glorious restoration that God promises to his people then, and it is there as we journey through Ezekiel. But consider this: here we are with communion. Consider how God chose to reveal himself supremely in Jesus through his perfect life, his sacrificial death, and his powerful resurrection. There's no storm. There's no cherubim, no wheels within wheels for us there. And yet, nevertheless, in that bread and that wine, there are visible signs of God's presence and God's power.